As you've been looking for stories for your story file and for stories to perform, you've probably noticed that there are lots of different types of folk tales in the books and anthologies that you've discovered. A lot of students ask, what is the difference between a folk tale and a fairy tale? Well, actually, a fairy tale is a type of folk tale. A folk tale is a story that's come down through the oral tradition in a culture and only written down in recent years. We've lost the idea of who created it in the first place, but it's a story that tends to attach itself to a culture. Now, within folklore, there are a number of different types of stories, and a fairy tale is actually just one of those. Now, to confuse you even further, the term fairy tale is often used as a generic term for folk tales. So when we think of the classic fairy tales, we're thinking of Sleeping Beauty, Rumpelstiltskin, Cinderella, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, those. And all of those are folk tales, only some of them are fairy tales. In fact, I think the ones that I just mentioned are all fairy tales. A fairy tale is a magical tale. But not all folk tales involve magic. So what I want to do now is to talk to you about the different types of folk tales that there are, and give you some little glimpses into some of those stories. I'm not going to tell you the whole stories, because otherwise we'd be here for an hour and a half listening to this. Maybe what I'll do is I'll have some separate files with some of these stories for you to watch at a later time. But I'll give you an idea of what they're all about. The first kind of story that I want to talk to you about in folklore is one that's referred to as a cumulative tale. A cumulative tale is a story when one element builds upon the other. One story that you might be familiar with is The Old Woman Who Swallowed a Fly. Most of us know it in its song form, although I'm not going to sing it for you. Oh, maybe I will. You know, the one that goes, "There was an old lady who swallowed a fly. I don't know why she swallowed the fly, perhaps she'll die. There was an old lady who swallowed a spider that wriggled and jiggled and tickled inside her. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly. I don't know why she swallowed the fly. Perhaps she'll die. I know an old lady who swallowed a bird." And anyway, it goes on. You remember the one. And it goes, she swallowed a bird, and then a cat, and a dog, and a goat, and a cow, and at the end, I know an old lady who swallowed a horse. She's dead, of course. You probably remember that one. Another one that you might not know is a Japanese story called The Stonecutter. And this is a one where a stonecutter is chipping away at a rock, and he looks up, the sun is hot on his back, and he thinks, the sun is more powerful than me. I wish I were the sun. And he becomes the sun. So it's also got some magic in it, so it makes it a fairy tale. Okay, it's got some magic going on. He becomes the sun, and then the clouds come in, and he thinks that the clouds are more powerful than him, so he wants to be the clouds. And then it rains, and then the rain is on the mountain, and the mountain is most powerful, until when he becomes the mountain, because he's become all these things, suddenly there's a stonecutter at the bottom of the mountain, and he's chipping away at the rock. And he realizes that, after all, as a stonecutter, he was the most powerful. So this one is a cumulative tale because one thing is based upon another, but it's also a circular tale. One that I mentioned to you last time was The Old Woman Who Lived in a Vinegar Bottle. And this is a circular story that comes from England, and it is the one where she wishes to live in a better house, and she says, "Oh, I shouldn't live in this miserable little hovel. No, I want to live in a nice little cottage, you know, with pink roses growing up about the door and a picket fence." And a fairy comes along and grants her her wish. Well, then she's got her in her little cottage, and then she wants to live closer to town. "Oh, no, I want to live down by the marketplace. Nice little row house, one of those new ones they've just built, with lace curtains and the market just down the way." And the fairy grants her that. But of course then she gets fed up with all of the farm traffic going by and all of the manure on the ground. And so she says she wants to live in a fancy home up on the hill, and so she gets a little bit more snooty. And she wants to have servants and people to bring her her cup of tea. and she gets granted that. Then, of course, she wants to live in a fancy home down in the fancy neighborhood in town, and then she wants to be the queen, and in the end she is the queen. But why should I be the queen of such a small and paltry kingdom? I wish to be empress of the world. And of course the fairy says, well, there is no such thing as the empress of the world, and so sends her all the way back to the little hovel that she lives in at the beginning of the story. Again, a circular story. Another kind of story that you might enjoy is a pourquoi story. A story that is referred to as pourquoi, which is French for why, is a how and why story. How do things exist? What do they look like? Why are the stars and the moon in the sky? Why is that hill that shape? Why does a rabbit have long ears and a short tail? There are cultures all over the world that really created so many of these explanatory tales, either about the mythological beginnings of the world or about animal characteristics. Maybe it is about topography, the land, celestial explanations. And all around the world you have stories that explain so many of these things. There are stories from the Amazon about the stars in the sky, and it was all because the children kept following the women who had discovered corn and were eating it without the men's knowledge. And when the women saw the children, they ran after them, and the children ran because the women would be so mad, and they gathered all of the sticks and poles and ropes that they could find, wrapped with vines, and they made a ladder to the sky, and all of the children hid in the sky. But the last child accidentally kicked the ladder down, and it fell to the ground, and they were never able to come back down. And so the stars in the sky are the children. Another star story is from Oregon. Some of you might have been to Crater Lake. Well, there is a myth about Crater Lake that was created by Coyote. You see, Coyote used to sit on the hill and howl to the stars. He was in love with the blue evening star. And the evening star kept on seeing him, and, she thought she'd play with him, so she picked him up and took him on her journeys. Well, then, she got fed up with him and cast him down to the ground. Well, she threw him so hard that it carved out a great crater. Coyote lay in the bottom of the crater, and he wept. And because he was covered in blue stardust, the tears coursed down his face and washed off the blue stardust and filled the crater, and that is what created Crater Lake, and that's why it's as blue as that it is. One from right around here. If you look to the east, we have Como Kulshan. Como Kulshan is, of course, Mount Baker. And Mount Baker used to have 2 wives, and one went traveling to the south, but she was, a little suspicious of the other wife, and so she drew herself up taller and taller, and she's still there, watching Como Kulshan. She is Mount Rainier. The other wife wanted to visit her mother out in the ocean, and so she carved out the Nooksack Valley, and she went and lay in the water with her mother and her siblings, and she is the islands. There are stories from around the Pacific Northwest all about why the weather is the way it is, why possum is so ugly. I've got to tell you that story sometime. It's totally gross and very funny. But there are so many stories that explain. Native Americans from all over North America and South America are particularly known for their pourquoi stories. Many of them are animal characteristics, but some of them are issues such as why the salmon migrates upstream, why people and animals don't talk to one another anymore, why frog and snake aren't friends anymore. All of these kinds of stories. There's one all about crabs, and they used to throw their eyes out and look over the ocean, but stay up high enough so that the Onka fish wouldn't eat them. And then Jaguar comes along and wants to know how to do that. And Crab teaches him, but in the end Jaguar loses his eyes and it's all a big mess. And because Crab is so embarrassed by his mistake, he hides under a rock. And so that's why when you see a crab, its eyes don't go very far anymore, just on little stalks. And you usually will find the crab hiding underneath a rock because he's too shy to show himself. All sorts of stories like this you'll find around the world. In Australia, they are particularly also known for their pourquoi and how and why stories. One of them I met when I was in Australia. It's the frog who couldn't laugh, but I heard it first, just from somebody who knew the surroundings. My son was 8, and we were spending some time up near Darwin and Kakadu National Park, Catherine Gorge, beautiful places like that. If you ever go adventuring, I highly recommend it. So we went there, and it was during the dry season, but people told us about in the wet season there were so many frogs. Well, I looked around and I thought, well, if there were frogs during the wet season, where are they during the dry season? And so the person I was speaking to told me that there's a type of frog in the north of Australia who is particularly good at drinking water and slurped up all of the water that it possibly could until these frogs are sort of round and turgid and they burrow into the earth underneath the mud, and when the surface dries up they're able to live with all of the moisture that they have in their body. But the Aboriginals would know where they would be, and they would dig them with digging sticks, and they would have a nice, juicy, tasty lunch for when they found a frog. So this story is an ancient story, The Frog Who Wouldn't Laugh. It's also called Tiddalik the Frog, and there are other versions of it that you can find maybe in a book, an anthology of Aboriginal folklore. This one's simply an illustrated version of the story. And it's all about a very large frog who just drank all the water in Australia, and the animals tried very hard to get him to give the water back. And they tickled him, and they made jokes to make him laugh. And it's a fun one to do with children, if you're working with children, because they love to guess what animal, and then you have to think about the features that the animals would have in order to try to get Tiddalik the frog to laugh. Well, in the end, it's little Nurang the eel who's able to get Tiddalik to laugh. He jumps up on his belly, great distended belly, and he tickles him. And after a while, Tiddalik laughs and the water comes out. But because he's lying on the beach, most of it goes out into the ocean and not onto the dry land. And so then the water is still not on the dry land, and that is why Australia is as dry as it is today. So as you're looking at stories, you will find so many of these explanatory stories that will really just kind of give an idea of how the world was created, or the explanations that people had for looking about them and saying, I wonder why. To me, the folk tales of pourquoi, questioning, is really a part of that characteristics that humans have for inquisitiveness, wanting to know, really sort of the beginnings of science, the hypothesis for why things are the way they are. And these stories have survived, even though that science has taught us much more about the realities of how the world has come together. These folk tales were part of that inquisitiveness that humans have always had in order to get us to think about the world around us. Another type of story is a beast tale. A beast tale is simply a folk tale that has animals in it. And you will find these all over the place. But interestingly, what you will find is that in some cultures, beast tales, or any story with animals in it, some of them are realistic animals and some of them are mythological. Some of you might be familiar with many of the mythological beasts around the world, whether it be trolls or dragons, whether it be the kraken from nautical history and lore. There are going to be so many of these mythological beasts, but some show up more in cultures than others. Europe and Asia have quite a lot of mythological beasts. Of course, the ancient Greek and Roman myths had many of them as well. But some places you find them less. Especially in the African continent, most of the stories that are told there are about people or about the real animals, lion and tiger, hippopotamus, giraffe, zebra. They are about the real animals. And that is mostly the case also in the North American continent with the Native Americans and First Nations people. That most of those have realistic animals, although not always. So keep your eye out. If you're interested in Native American folklore, keep your eye out for a few mythological creatures. Now, that said about beast tales, just because an animal can talk in a story doesn't make it magical. It just makes it unusual. But in folklore, a talking animal is actually quite usual. It's usually thought of as being quite normal. Now, a fairy tale is the most magical, where there are transformations, potions, things that really actually by magic and complete unusual happenstance make things change. So that somebody is cursed, and so therefore when they speak, slugs and toads come out of their mouth every time they speak. And that would be quite disgusting. But her sister, who was a much nicer girl, she had, well, rubies and diamonds came out of her mouth every time she spoke. That would be useful. But magical tales are when those magic things happen. So sleeping for 100 years and being woken. Of course, let's not get into the old versions of the stories. Some of you might remember with Sleeping Beauty that it actually wasn't his kiss that woke her up. It was 9 months later when she gave birth to twins. But you might not want to talk about that one with kids. I'd stick with the modern version if I were you. But there are so many versions, and I know you've been studying that also to be able to find different ways that different stories end, or different versions of the way that they have been put together. And the fairy tales, they change quite a lot, and there are many stories that you will find that have those magical qualities to them. The European stories are particularly in the fairy tale realm with magic. And lastly, there are realistic tales. These are not as common as the other types. It seems that human beings really do enjoy fantasy, sideways stories, things that involve the talking animal, the magic, the unusual, the fictional, way beyond ourselves as humans. But there are some cultures that are very, very good at creating stories that, well, are realistic, that you could actually imagine happening. Many of the Asian stories, especially Japanese stories and Chinese stories, do involve quite a number of stories that involve elders and respect for the elder and respect for nature, and some very realistic stories about a gift of a plum tree to an emperor by a little boy, that sort of thing. There's one from China that is my favorite. It's called The Empty Pot, about a king who wanted to find someone to be an heir after him. He had no children, and so he gathered all the children, he gave them all a seed, told them to plant it, come back next year with what they grew. When they came back, everybody had pots full of beautiful things except our protagonist, who we followed through the story, who's tried to get the seed to grow, and nothing they can do can make him or her, because sometimes it's a girl in the story depending on the variation, they can't grow anything, and so they're embarrassed. They have an empty pot, nothing to show. Well, the emperor comes and looks at all of the children, sees what they've got, is very impressed by their flowers, but not very impressed by what he has discovered. Finally, he finds the child with the empty pot, and the child is very apologetic. "Oh, Your Majesty, please forgive me. This is as good as I can do. I tried, I watered it. I kept it well, but nothing grew." And of course, as you probably imagined, that was the trick. The emperor said to the child, "You will be the king or queen after I am gone, the emperor or the empress, because this is what I did to trick you. I wanted to see who would be honest. All of the seeds that I gave you had been boiled, and none of them should have grown. And so this child was the only one who was honest, and brought what they should have been able to grow with the seed that had been given. Nothing." It's a great story and really a lot of fun. Other realistic stories that you can find are going to be found, a lot of them are found in Jewish folk tales. I think I've shown you this book before. But Jewish folk tales are very much about the way people communicate with one another. There's some tricksters and there's some really silly people, but some of them are very, very clever. One of my very favorites are stories about Johar. And Johar is a trickster in Middle Eastern Jewish tradition, and he is often found in Turkey. Anyway, so one day Johar, he's sitting in the marketplace, and he's sipping his coffee and eating his honeyed cakes, and people mocked him. Johar, you will have no money if you will not get off your rear end and work. And Johar said, well, I am not a fool, as you say. I might be a fool, but I am certainly not the greatest fool, and I am not the only fool. When it is time for me to need money, I will find it. Well, some time later he got up and he put down his coffee and his honeyed cake, and he announced that he was going to sell his house. Well, the camel trader came and said, how much do you want for your house? And he said, well, let's see. My house is worth 20,000 dinars, but I shall sell it to you for only 10. Well, the camel trader wondered, how is he going to earn a profit if he is going to only sell it to me for half the price? But he's not going to complain, so he says, I will pay you. So he pays Johar 10,000 dinars, but there's one restriction. Johar says, the house is yours, the courtyard is yours, the walls are yours, the furniture is yours, all except the nail that is above the door. Well, the camel trader doesn't seem to think this is too bad of a thing. Just a nail. And so he moves in with his family. And Johar goes back to sitting in the marketplace, drinking his coffee, eating his honeyed cakes. And one day, well, he decides it's time to earn some money. So he gets up, puts down his coffee and his honeyed cake, and he goes and he picks up an old dirty sack from the rubbish heap. And he goes to the fishmonger and he asks for the smelliest old fish that he's got, and he puts it in the sack. He goes to the cheese merchant and he buys the smelliest, softest cheese, and he puts that in the sack. And he goes all around the marketplace to the butcher, the baker, even the candlestick maker, puts the smelly things into the bag, walks up to his old house and hangs the bag on the hook, on the nail over the door. Well, pretty soon it really begins to stink, and the flies come, and it's dripping, and pretty soon the camel trader and his family cannot live in the house anymore. And the camel trader comes and says, Johar, why did you do this? Take that sack away. Johar says, you have the house and the courtyard and the wall. I have only that nail to hang my bag on. You will have to move out if you don't want to smell it. And so the camel trader did. But he came to Johar and he said, Johar, please, no one will buy the house with that wretched smelly bag on the nail. Please, would you buy the house back? And Johar said, all right, it is worth 20,000 originally, and you paid 10,000 for it. But I'll tell you, with that sack of stink hanging over the door, that house isn't worth anything. I'll give you 1,000 dinars for it. And the camel trader accepted. And so, with 9,000 dinars of profit, Johar went back to the marketplace, and he sat with his coffee and his honeyed cakes, and waited for the next time, wherein he could show that he might be a fool, but he's not the only fool, and definitely not the greatest fool. Another realistic book, a story that you might enjoy, especially for those of you who perhaps enjoy math, this one's called One Grain of Rice, and it's a story about Rani in India who takes back a small handful of rice that has fallen out of one of the king's camel's saddlebags. And the Raja asks her whether she would like a reward. And she said, I would like 1 grain of rice. Is that all you want? Yes, she said, today and tomorrow you will give me 2 grains of rice. The next day, 4 grains of rice. 4 grains of rice. and so on. For 30 days you will double the amount of rice you gave me before. And the Raja thinks this is a very modest request. But as those of you who know extrapolation, of course it's not a modest request. And she winds up emptying the royal storehouses. There are some fantastic pictures in this book of all the royal reindeer, and it spreads out all of the saddlebags. Here we go. Carried by all of the elephants emptying the storehouses. It's very clever, and it's a really nice idea for a book that you can use in a math classroom. Another one, this was published not too long after the tsunami in Japan, and this is actually, and you might have heard this on the news, there were stories from some of the villages, not only from Japan but also from the Indonesian tsunami that there was a few years ago, that there were villages who were saved from the tsunami because some of the old people remembered stories about people who knew that when the water sucked out, don't go down to the beach, but run to the highlands. And this story is about Oji-san, grandfather, who up on the cliffs of Japan had his rice fields in terraces going down toward the shore. And one day, as he was sitting and looking out into the ocean, he saw that the ocean waves were being sucked out, and the people were running down to the shore to gather the fish and the shellfish. And he remembered an old story, but he had no time to go and warn them, and his voice wasn't loud enough. And so he took a flint, and he lit sparks, and he lit all of his ripe, dry rice fields alight. And the people turned and said, "Oji-san's fields are on fire, we must go and help him put out the fire." So they all came in from the shore to help Oji-san, and, of course, they were saved. And because of his generosity to sacrifice his rice fields, the people were saved from the tsunami. And so, when you look for stories, you're going to find a lot of these realistic tales, fun ones, could exist, definitely could exist within the realm of our possibility. Many of them are trickster stories, and a lot of them are just really amusing or wise stories about the way that people exist with one another. That's a little bit about different types of folk tales, and we'll talk again. Bye.